The morning sun hadn't quite burned off the last of the city's haze yet, but inside the ABC studio in Midtown Manhattan, everything was already buzzing. The air smelled faintly of coffee, hairspray, and that weird mix of electronics and carpet that only TV studios seem to have. Backstage, crew members darted between monitors and cables, adjusting lights, checking mics, whispering into headsets. A few audience members, mostly women who'd won tickets through a radio contest or signed up weeks ago, were being led to their seats, chatting excitedly, snapping selfies, trying not to look too starstruck. It was just another Tuesday for The View, but not quite. Today's guest was different. Keanu Reeves was coming. Now, Keanu wasn't exactly a stranger to talk shows. He'd done his share over the years, calm, polite, always a little reserved, never one for flashy stories or wild antics. But something about his presence always left people talking. Maybe it was the way he listened more than he spoke. Maybe it was how he treated everyone, the makeup artist, the intern holding the cue cards, the security guard, with the same quiet respect. Or maybe it was just that in a world full of noise, he seemed to carry a kind of stillness with him, like he'd seen a lot and chosen kindness anyway. Back in the green room, he sat alone, not scrolling on a phone or pacing nervously like some guests did. He just sat, wearing a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, and well-worn boots. Around his neck hung a simple silver pendant on a thin chain. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive-looking. Just a small, smooth piece of metal that caught the light every now and then when he moved. He didn't fiddle with it. He didn't hide it. It was just there, like part of him. Meanwhile, in the main studio, the hosts were getting mic'd up. Whoopi Goldberg, the show's anchor and resident truth-teller, leaned back in her chair, sipping herbal tea from a chipped, "I survived another meeting" mug. She was in a good mood, cracking jokes with Joy, giving Sarah a hard time about her new haircut, laughing loud and easy like always. Whoopi had been doing this for decades. She knew how to read a room, how to land a punchline, how to keep things moving when the energy dipped. She also knew how to push buttons, sometimes gently, sometimes not, because that's what made TV interesting. "All right, people," a producer called from the edge of the set. "We're live in 5. Keanu's on deck. Keep it light, he's promoting that new action flick, but he's also, well, you know, Keanu." Everyone nodded. They all knew. The opening music swelled. The audience clapped on cue. The red on-air lights blinked on above each camera. And just like that, the show began. Whoopi launched into her usual monologue, quick takes on the news, a jab at a politician, a funny story about her dog stealing her slippers. The audience laughed right on schedule. Then came the guest intro. "And now," Whoopi said, turning toward the side entrance with a wide smile, "a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Star of The Matrix, John Wick, and about 100 other movies we've all watched way too many times. Please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves." Applause erupted, louder than usual, genuine, excited. Keanu walked out slowly, not rushing, not waving like a rock star, just offering a small, humble nod as he made his way to the guest chair. He shook hands with each host, firm but gentle, and sat down, folding his hands in his lap. "Look at you," Whoopi said, leaning forward with a grin. "Still looking like you just stepped out of a dream. How do you do it?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I don't know," he said, voice low and calm. "I just try to be okay." The audience awed. Joy rolled her eyes playfully. The interview started smoothly. They talked about the new movie, stunts, training, how many times he'd pulled a muscle this time. Answer: a few. He gave short but thoughtful answers, never bragging, always giving credit to the stunt team, the director, the crew. Classic Keanu. Then, about 10 minutes in, Whoopi's eyes drifted downward. She noticed the necklace. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small silver disc on a simple chain. But it stood out against his plain shirt. And in that moment, her comedian's instinct kicked in. She leaned back, raised an eyebrow, and said with a chuckle, "Wait a minute, what's this? You wearing jewelry now? Next thing we know, you'll be dropping rhymes and dancing on TikTok." The audience laughed. It was meant to be light, a little tease. The kind of thing that happens on morning TV all the time. Hosts poking fun at guests' outfits, their hair, their quirks. Nothing malicious. Just banter. Sarah grinned. Joy snorted. Even the camera operator chuckled quietly off to the side. But Keanu didn't laugh. He didn't scowl or look offended. He just paused. His eyes dropped to the pendant for a second like he was remembering something far away. Then he looked back at Whoopi, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet sadness that seemed to fill the whole room. And then he spoke. "This," he said softly, "was my sister's." The laughter died instantly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She passed away from leukemia," he continued, his voice steady but tender. "I wear it to remember her." Silence. Not the awkward kind you try to fill with nervous chatter. Not the dead air you panic over. This was different, heavy, real. Whoopi's smile vanished. Her hand moved to her chest like she'd been gently punched in the heart. Her eyes widened, then softened with instant regret. "Oh, Keanu," she whispered, her voice cracking just a little. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." No one moved. The audience sat completely still. Even the floor director, usually waving frantic hand signals from the wings, had stopped. Keanu nodded once, slowly. "It's okay," he said. "Most people don't know." And just like that, the mood in the studio shifted. The bright lights, the cameras, the whole machinery of daytime TV, it all faded into the background. For a few seconds, it wasn't a show anymore. It was just two people, one carrying grief he never talked about, the other realizing she'd accidentally stepped on something sacred. The silence stretched, not because no one knew what to say, but because words suddenly felt too small. In that moment, something changed. Not just for the people in the room, but for everyone who would later see the clip. Because Keanu Reeves, a man famous for playing heroes on screen, had just shown what real strength looked like, not in explosions or fight scenes, but in the courage to carry love through loss and to speak gently even when hurt. And Whoopi, a woman known for her sharp tongue and fearless takes, showed something too, the grace to stop, listen, and say sorry without excuses. The producer, watching from the control booth, later said he almost forgot to breathe. Back on set, no one rushed to fill the quiet. No upbeat music swelled in. No one cut to commercial. They just let it sit. Because sometimes, silence says more than any script ever could. And though the show would go on, more questions, more laughter, more promotion, that one quiet exchange would linger long after the camera stopped rolling. Because in a world that often rewards loudness, speed, and shock, this small human moment reminded everyone watching that the deepest things in life are often carried quietly. Like a simple silver pendant worn close to the heart. The silence in the studio didn't last long, but it felt like forever. It wasn't the kind of quiet that makes you squirm. It was deeper than that. The kind that settles in your chest and makes you think. 1 second, the room had been full of easy laughter and bright lights. The next, it was like someone had turned down the volume on the whole world. Whoopi sat very still. Her usual spark, the one that made her so quick with a joke or a sharp comeback, was gone. In its place was something softer, something real. She looked at Keanu, really looked at him, and for the first time that morning she wasn't playing a role. She wasn't the host. She was just a person who'd said something without thinking, and now she saw the weight of it. "I'm so sorry," she said again, quieter this time. Her voice didn't carry the usual confidence. It was raw, almost fragile. "I didn't mean, I just thought it was—" She stopped herself. There was no excuse. She knew that. Keanu gave a small nod. Not to brush it off, but to say, "I understand." He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt in a dramatic way. It was more like he'd been carrying this truth for so long that sharing it didn't shock him. It just was. "It's okay," he repeated gently. "You didn't know, and that was it. No blame, no lecture, just grace." In the audience, a woman wiped her eyes quickly, pretending to adjust her glasses. A man in the front row leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he was trying to process something bigger than a TV interview. Even the crew, usually focused on cables, lighting, timing, had slowed down. One camera operator kept rolling, but his shoulders were less tense, like he'd forgotten he was working. Back on the couch, the other hosts sat frozen. One of them reached out and lightly touched Whoopi's arm, a silent, "It's okay." But Whoopi didn't look away from Keanu. She was still holding that moment, letting it sink in. Then slowly she took a breath. "Your sister," she began, then paused. "What was her name?" "Kim," Keanu said. Just one word, but it carried so much. "Kim," Whoopi repeated softly, like she was trying the name on her tongue, giving it the respect it deserved. "How old was she?" 36, he said. She fought it for a long time. No extra details. No dramatic retelling. Just the facts. Spoken with the kind of calm that only comes after years of living with loss. Story for the audience. That was part of her gift. Knowing when to talk and when to just be present. After a few beats, she leaned back slightly, her posture less stiff now. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "And for wearing it. That's beautiful." Keanu offered the faintest smile. Not a big one. Just enough to say, "Hank, thank you for seeing it." The tension in the room began to ease. Not because the moment was over, but because it had been handled with care. Like someone had carefully picked up a broken vase, not to hide the cracks, but to show that even broken things can still hold meaning. The producer in the control room finally exhaled. He'd been holding his breath without realizing it. He glanced at the clock. They were running a little behind, but no one was going to cut this short. Not now. Whoopi nodded slowly. She didn't ask for more. She didn't pry. She just let the truth sit there, honored it by not turning it into a et. The conversation shifted. Gently. Whoopi steered it back toward the movie, but the tone had changed. It wasn't just promotion anymore. It was human. She asked Keanu about what drives him to keep working, what keeps him going on hard days. He thought for a moment. "Connection," he said. "Stories that remind people they're not alone. That's always mattered to me." The audience listened differently now. They weren't just watching a celebrity. They were listening to someone who'd known deep pain and still chose to show up, with kindness, with work, with a necklace he never took off. Later, people would say that was the moment the interview became something special, not because of the slip-up, but because of what came after. Honesty, humility, and a quiet kind of courage that doesn't need explosions or headlines to be powerful. When the segment finally wrapped, the applause was different too. Slower, softer, more like gratitude than excitement. As the cameras cut and the stage lights dimmed slightly, Whoopi turned to Keanu again. "Really?" she said, voice low so only he could hear. "I'm sorry." He looked at her and nodded. "It's all right," he said. "You said you were sorry. That's what matters." And just like that, the mistake didn't define the moment, it became part of something bigger. A reminder that we all say things without thinking sometimes. But what we do next, that's what shows who we really are. Backstage, as Keanu stood to leave the set, a stagehand, a young woman who'd been watching from the wings, hesitated, then stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves?" she said shyly. He turned. "Yeah? My brother passed last year," she said, voice trembling just a little. "I wear his watch every day. People sometimes make jokes. I just wanted to say thank you for saying what you said." Keanu didn't say much. He just looked at her, really looked at her, and gave a small, understanding nod. Then quietly he said, "Keep wearing it." She smiled through tears and stepped back. Meanwhile, Whoopi stayed in her chair for a minute longer than usual. She stared at her notes, but she wasn't reading them. She was thinking. About Kim, about grief, about how easy it is to make a joke without knowing what someone's carrying. When she finally stood, she didn't head straight to her dressing room. She walked over to the producer. "We're keeping that moment in, right?" she asked. "Absolutely," he said. "People need to see that," she nodded. "Good." Later that afternoon, a short clip from the show began circulating online. Not the whole interview, just that one exchange. The tease, the pause, the truth. The silence. Comments started pouring in. "This wrecked me. Keanu is just different." Whoopi handled that with so much heart. Never judge what someone wears. You don't know their story. News outlets picked it up. Not as gossip, but as a rare moment of realness on live TV. Mental health groups shared it, saying it opened the door for conversations about grief and how it stays with us, sometimes in the smallest ways. A photo, a song, a piece of jewelry. But in the studio, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that two people had met in a messy, human moment, and instead of running from it, they faced it together. And that's what made it unforgettable. Because in a world that often feels staged, edited and polished to perfection, this was raw, real, unscripted. No one planned it. No one wanted it to happen. But in the end, it became the most important part of the whole show. Not because of the mistake, but because of the kindness that followed. And sometimes, that's enough to remind us all to look a little closer, speak a little gentler, and remember, everyone's carrying something we can't see. Backstage, the air felt different. Not tense, not awkward, but changed, like the whole building had taken a deep breath and let it out slowly. The usual rush of post-segment energy, the hurried footsteps, the headset chatter, the quick resets for the next guest, had softened into something quieter, more thoughtful. Keanu walked off the set with his hands in his pockets, head slightly down, not because he was upset, but because he was carrying the weight of what he'd just shared. It wasn't something he talked about often. In fact, he rarely did. He'd worn that pendant for years, through movie premieres, red carpets, interviews, even action scenes where it sometimes got tucked under a costume or taped down so it wouldn't catch on anything. But he never took it off. Not once. It wasn't about superstition. It was about love. Kim had given it to him during one of her hospital stays back when they still believed she might beat it. She'd said, "If I go, you keep this. So I'm always with you." He'd laughed it off then, told her not to talk like that. But she'd pressed it into his palm anyway, her fingers thin but steady. And now, all these years later, it was still there. Cool against his skin, a quiet promise kept. He didn't regret saying it out loud. But it still left him feeling a little exposed, like he'd opened a door he usually kept closed. Meanwhile, Whoopi hadn't moved from her chair. She sat there long after the camera stopped rolling, staring at the empty guest seat. Her co-hosts had already stood up, murmuring to each other, glancing back at her with concern. One of them placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" Whoopi nodded but didn't look up right away. "Yeah," she said softly, "just thinking." She wasn't used to feeling this way after a joke. She'd made thousands over the years, some sharp, some silly, some that pushed boundaries. That's part of what made her who she was, fearless, honest, unafraid to say what others wouldn't. But this time, it wasn't about pushing a boundary. It was about stepping on something sacred without realizing it, and that sat differently in her gut. She wasn't angry at herself, but she was humbled. After a minute, she stood up, smoothed her blazer, and walked toward the backstage hallway. She didn't know if Keanu was still around, but she needed to see him again. Not on camera, not for the audience. Just person to person. She found him near the dressing room door, talking quietly with a member of the hair and makeup team, a woman who'd worked on him earlier and now had tears in her eyes. Keanu was listening, nodding, giving her space to speak. When he saw Whoopi, he excused himself gently and turned toward her. "Hey," he said. Just one word, calm as ever. "Hey," she replied. She didn't launch into another apology. She just looked at him, really looked, and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not making me feel like a monster," she said with a small, tired smile. "For being you." He shook his head slightly. "You didn't know. But I should have thought," she said. "I talk for a living. I should know better than to assume." He didn't argue. He just stood there present, letting her say what she needed to say. Then, after a pause, he added, "People carry a lot. Sometimes it's in their eyes. Sometimes it's in what they wear. Sometimes it's in what they don't say." She nodded. "Yeah." They stood in silence for a moment. Not the heavy kind from before, but a comfortable one. Like two people who just shared something real and didn't need to fill it with noise. Finally, Whoopi said, "Do you ever talk about her?" "Kim, I mean." "Not much," he admitted. "Not because I don't want to. Just, it's hard to put into words." She was full of life. Even when she was sick, she'd crack jokes, make the nurses laugh. She loved music. Old soul records. She'd play them in the hospital room, even when she could barely sit up. Whoopi smiled faintly. "Sounds like she was something special." "She was," Keanu said simply. They talked a little more, about how grief doesn't go away, it just changes shape. About how some days are easier than others. About how wearing something of someone's isn't about holding on too tight. It's about honoring what was real. No cameras. No audience. Just two people, one famous, one grieving. The other regretful. Meeting in the messy middle of being human. Later, as Keanu prepared to leave, a young intern, maybe 19 or 20, hesitated near the exit. He'd been watching from a distance, holding a clipboard like it was a shield. Finally, he stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu turned. "Yeah?" The young man swallowed. "My mom, she passed last year. I wear her ring on a chain. People sometimes ask if it's a fashion thing. He looked down, embarrassed. I wanted to say I get it. And thank you for saying it out loud. Keanu didn't say much. He just reached out and gave the young man's shoulder a light squeeze. Keep wearing it, he said again, like it was a mantra. The intern nodded, eyes shiny, and stepped back. As Keanu walked out the studio doors into the New York afternoon, the city noise rushed in. Honking cabs, distant sirens, people talking on phones. But inside him there was a strange kind of peace. He hadn't planned to share that part of his life today. But maybe it was time. Maybe someone out there needed to hear it. Back inside, Whoopi returned to the studio. The crew was resetting for the next segment, but she asked if she could have a minute alone on set. They nodded and gave her space. She sat back in her chair, looked out at the empty audience seats, and took a deep breath. Then, without planning it, she leaned toward the nearest open mic, still live to the control room, and said, "Hey, can we do a quick note before we go to break?" The producer's voice came through her earpiece. "Sure, go ahead." She faced the camera, not with her usual bold energy, but with a quiet sincerity that surprised even her. "Earlier today," she began, "I made a comment about our guest's necklace, and he told me it belonged to his sister who passed away. And I want to say, on air, that I'm truly sorry for my thoughtless remark. And I want to thank him for his grace." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But more than that, I want to remind all of us, myself included, that you never know what someone's carrying. A piece of jewelry, a quiet look, a hesitation. It might mean more than we realize. So maybe we all slow down a little. Listen more. Assume less." She gave a small, genuine smile. "All right. Back to the show." The crew clapped softly. Not the big applause of a performance, but the kind you give when someone does the right thing. That short message aired during the next commercial break as a text overlay, then again at the top of the hour. Within minutes, people started sharing it online. Not to shame, but to reflect. One viewer tweeted, "Whoopi just reminded me of my grandma's locket. Haven't worn it in years. Gonna put it on tomorrow." Another wrote, "This is why I keep my dad's old watch in my pocket. Not for show, just so I remember he's with me." The story wasn't about a mistake anymore. It had become something else, a ripple of empathy. And in a world that often feels divided, loud, and rushed, that quiet moment backstage between two people choosing kindness over ego became a reminder that healing often starts with a single honest sentence. And the courage to say, "I'm sorry." No grand speeches. No drama, just humans trying their best, and sometimes that's more than enough. The days after the show aired felt different, not just for the people who'd been in the studio, but for thousands watching from their living rooms, kitchens, and late-night phone scrolls. What had started as a simple on-air moment, a joke, a pause, a quiet truth, began to spread in ways no one expected. Not as gossip, not as controversy, but as something softer, something that stuck in people's hearts like a song they couldn't stop humming. Online, the clip didn't go viral with flashy edits or dramatic captions. It just traveled, shared by teachers, nurses, veterans, parents, strangers who'd lost someone and never talked about it. Comments piled up, not angry, not mocking, but full of stories. "I wear my brother's dog tags. People think I'm in the military. I never correct them. My daughter's hair ribbon is in my wallet. 10 years gone and I still touch it every morning. Thank you, Keanu, for showing us it's okay to carry love with us, even when it hurts." News outlets picked it up, but not in the usual celebrity feud way. Instead, they called it a rare moment of grace on live TV, or a lesson in empathy. Mental health organizations shared it with messages like, "Grief doesn't have an expiration date, and neither does love." But back in real life, away from headlines and hashtags, the impact was quieter, more personal. At a bus stop in Chicago, a woman touched the small silver locket at her throat, something she hadn't opened in years. She'd been embarrassed to wear it lately, worried people would think it was outdated or weird. But after seeing the interview, she left it out the next day. And when a stranger smiled at it and said, "That's pretty," she simply replied, "It was my mom's." No shame, just truth. In a high school in Oregon, a teen who'd been teased for always wearing his grandfather's old baseball cap stopped tucking it into his backpack before class. He wore it proudly the next day. When someone asked why, he just said, He taught me how to throw a curveball. I keep him close. No one laughed. Even in the studio, things shifted. The crew started paying more attention, not just to what guests wore, but to how they carried themselves. A makeup artist began asking gently, "Is there anything you'd like me to work around?" Instead of assuming. A stage manager made a note to remind new interns, "Not everything is a prop, sometimes it's a memory." As for Whoopi, she didn't do interviews about the moment right away. She let it breathe. But a week later, during a quiet segment on the show, she brought it up again, not to rehash but to reflect. "You know," she said, leaning forward with that familiar warmth, "I've been thinking a lot about that day, about how easy it is to make a joke without seeing the whole picture. And I realized something. Humor is powerful, but so is humility. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, 'I was wrong.'" She paused, then added with a small smile, "Turns out, kindness gets better ratings than sarcasm anyway." The audience clapped, not wildly but with understanding, like they'd been there too. Meanwhile, Keanu went back to his life. He didn't give press interviews about the necklace. He didn't post about it on social media. He just kept living the way he always had, quietly, thoughtfully, showing up for his work and the people around him. But something had changed in how people saw him. Not as just an actor or a meme or the nicest guy in Hollywood, but as someone who carried loss with dignity and still chose to be gentle with the world. A few weeks later, he was spotted at a small bookstore in LA, signing copies of a new indie film's companion art book. A fan approached, nervous, holding a worn photo in a frame. "My sister," she said softly. "She loved your movies. She passed last year." Keanu didn't offer empty words like "she's in a better place." He just looked at the photo, then at the woman and said, "Tell me about her." And she did. For 10 minutes, right there between the shelves, she talked about her sister's laugh, her love of old westerns, how she'd, quote, "speed" every time they drove on the highway. Keanu listened, really listened, nodding, asking gentle questions. When she finished, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "Thank you," she whispered. He touched the pendant at his chest lightly, almost unconsciously. "She's still with you," he said. "In all the ways that matter." That moment wasn't filmed. No one posted it online, but it happened. And it mattered. Back in New York, Whoopi started ending each show with a small ritual. Not a big announcement, just a quiet sentence before the credits rolled. Sometimes it was, "Be kind, you never know what someone's going through." Other times, "Say what you mean what you say." It became a signature not because it was planned, but because it felt necessary. Producers noticed something else too. Viewer messages changed. Fewer angry rants, more letters that began with, "This reminded me of my dad," or "I haven't talked about my loss in years, but today I did." The show didn't become a grief support group. It stayed lively, funny, opinionated, but it carried a new layer of heart. Even the network took note. Executives, usually focused on ratings and trends, quietly encouraged other hosts to lean into authenticity. Not as a strategy, but as a value. Because what happened that day proved something simple but powerful. People don't just want entertainment. They want connection, and connection starts when someone dares to be real. Months later, at a film festival in Toronto, Keanu was asked during a Q&A if he ever regretted sharing personal things in interviews. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't share much," he said, "but when I do, it's because I hope it helps someone feel less alone. If my truth gives someone else permission to carry theirs, that's worth more than any movie." The room fell silent, not out of shock, but respect. Later that night, a journalist covering the event wrote in her notes, "He doesn't perform humanity. He lives it." And that was the thing no one could script or stage. The way a single moment of honesty, born from a mistake, softened by grace, could echo far beyond a TV studio. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about two people choosing in real time to respond with heart instead of ego, and in doing so, they gave permission to millions to do the same. Kids started wearing their grandparents' rings on chains. Veterans pinned old unit patches inside their jackets. Parents kept baby shoes on shelves not as relics but as reminders. None of it was loud. None of it needed an audience. But it was all part of the same quiet wave. Ripples from a studio in New York where someone said, This was my sister's, and someone else said, I'm sorry. And in a world that often rewards noise, that kind of quiet courage became its own kind of revolution, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wear your love openly, even if it's just a small silver pendant, hanging close to your heart. Time has a way of smoothing out the sharp edges of a moment, but sometimes it also deepens the meaning. What happened on that talk show didn't fade away like most TV segments do, forgotten by the next news cycle or buried under flashier headlines. Instead, it settled into people's lives like a quiet truth they could carry with them. A year later, you could still feel its echo, not in loud ways but in small ones. Like the way a teacher in Ohio started her class each Monday by asking, is there something or someone you're holding in your heart today? Not to make anyone share, just to remind them it was okay to carry both joy and sorrow at the same time. Or the way a barista in Seattle noticed a regular customer always touched a small charm on his keychain before ordering, and one day simply said, that means something to you, doesn't it? The man nodded, eyes glistening, and said, my daughter gave it to me. She's not here anymore. The barista didn't offer advice. She just said, I'm glad you brought her with you. These weren't grand gestures. They were human ones, and they all traced back, in some quiet way, to a single exchange between two people on live television, one who spoke from grief and one who listened with humility. Keanu never made a big deal of it. He didn't write a book about it or launch a campaign. He just kept living the way he always had, showing up, doing the work, treating strangers like friends. But people saw him differently now. Not as a distant movie star, but as someone who understood loss because he'd walked through it himself. At fan events, fewer people asked for selfies. More asked, how do you keep going when it hurts? And he'd always answer the same way. You remember the love. That's what stays. He still wore the pendant. Always. Sometimes hidden under a shirt, sometimes out in the open. It wasn't for show. It was for her. And in honoring that, he gave others permission to honor their own. Whoopi, too, carried the moment with her. She didn't dwell on the mistake, but she didn't forget it either. In interviews, when asked about regrets, she'd say, I've said plenty of things I wish I could take back. But that day taught me that saying I'm sorry isn't weakness, it's the start of something better. She even started a small segment on the show called The Quiet Things, where guests were invited to share an object they carried that held meaning. No drama, no performance, just story. One episode featured a firefighter who kept a melted badge from a fallen partner in his locker. Another had a musician who played her late mother's piano every morning before writing songs. The audience didn't clap wildly. They listened. And in that listening, something shifted. Social media, often a place of noise and outrage, even softened around the edges for a while. Hashtags like wear your love or carry them with you began popping up, not as trends, but as gentle reminders. People posted photos of old watches, handwritten notes, childhood toys tucked in drawers, all with captions like, this is how I keep them close. No one mocked. No one argued. For once, the internet felt like a place of shared humanity instead of division. Schools began using the clip in empathy workshops. Counselors played it for students dealing with loss, saying, see, even people who seem strong carry pain, and that's okay. Parents showed it to their kids and said, this is why we don't joke about things we don't understand. The studio where it all happened changed too, not in layout or lighting, but in spirit. New crew members were told the story during orientation, not as gossip, but as a lesson. On this set, we respect what people carry, even if we can't see it. A small plaque was placed near the guest green room, not naming anyone, just a quote someone had written after that day. The deepest things are often worn quietly. Years passed. The show went on. New guests came and went. But that moment remained, a quiet landmark in the show's history. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And Keanu? He kept working, made more movies, fought more villains on screen. But off-screen he became something else, a quiet symbol of resilience wrapped in kindness. At award shows, when others gave flashy speeches, he'd often just say, I'm grateful to be here. To everyone who's lost someone, you're not alone. And people would nod, some with tears because they knew he meant it. Once, at a charity event for cancer research, he met a young woman who'd survived leukemia. the same illness that took his sister. She was shy at first, but finally worked up the courage to approach him. "I saw that interview," she said, "and I just wanted to say, thank you for wearing her with you. It made me feel like my survival means something. Not just for me, but for the ones who didn't make it." He looked at her for a long moment, then gently touched his pendant. "She'd be happy you're here," he said. They didn't hug. They didn't pose for photos. They just stood there, two strangers connected by loss, hope, and a little piece of silver that carried more love than most people realize an object ever could. Back home, in cities and towns across the country, people kept living their lives. But now when they saw someone wearing something unusual, a faded bracelet, a chipped ring, a necklace that didn't match their outfit, they didn't smirk or whisper. They paused, maybe even smiled, because they remembered. They remembered that behind every quiet choice, there might be a story. They remembered that grief doesn't vanish, it transforms. They remembered that kindness costs nothing, but can change everything. And in a world that often feels rushed, loud, and disconnected, that memory became a kind of anchor. No one expected a simple TV moment to do all that. But sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from speeches or protests or viral stunts. They come from a single sentence spoken with honesty, and another spoken with regret, meeting in the middle with grace. The studio's silence that day wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, full of respect, full of the unspoken truth that we're all carrying something, and maybe, just maybe, that's what makes us human. So years later, when someone sees a man in a black t-shirt with a small silver pendant and wonders about it, they don't laugh. They think of Kim. They think of love that outlives death. They think of how even in the spotlight, the quietest things can speak the loudest, and in that thought the moment lives on. Not as a clip, not as a headline, but as a gentle reminder. Be kind, listen closely, and never underestimate the weight of what someone wears next to their heart. There's a quiet kind of magic in how one honest moment can keep unfolding long after the cameras stop rolling, long after the headlines fade, long after most people would have moved on. What began as a simple exchange on a morning talk show didn't just end with a lesson or a viral clip. It kept growing like a seed planted in soft earth, sending roots deeper than anyone expected. 5 years later, you could still see its traces, not in billboards or awards, but in the everyday choices people made without even realizing where the idea came from. In a small town in Minnesota, a high school started a new tradition. Every spring, students were invited to bring an object that honored someone they'd lost, a photo, a letter, a piece of jewelry, and place it in a glass case in the library for a week. No names were required. No speeches, just quiet acknowledgement. The idea had come from a teacher who'd watched that interview with her own mother, who'd passed the year before. "I wore her scarf that day," she later said. "And when Keanu said what he said, it felt like permission to stop hiding my grief." At a veterans center in Texas, a group of former service members began wearing dog tags, not just their own, but those of fallen comrades on simple chains. One man said people used to ask if it was part of a costume. Now they just nod, like they understand. Even in hospitals, things shifted. Nurses started asking patients, "Is there something special you'd like to keep with you during your stay?" Instead of assuming all personal items were clutter. A young cancer patient in Boston wore her grandmother's locket through every round of chemo. When a new nurse noticed it and gently asked about it, the girl opened up for the first time in weeks. That small question led to a conversation that helped her feel seen, not just as a patient, but as a person carrying love through pain. Keanu never knew most of these stories. He wasn't tracking the impact like a campaign. He was just living his life, still wearing the pendant, still showing up with the same quiet decency that had always defined him. But people kept noticing, not because he asked them to, but because his consistency spoke louder than any performance ever could. He turned down offers to monetize the moment, no merchandise, no documentaries, no inspirational speaking tours. When a brand once suggested a limited edition necklace inspired by his story, he politely declined. "It's not mine to sell," he told them. "It's hers." That refusal, whispered through industry circles, only deepened the respect people had for him. In a world where everything gets turned into content, He protected the sacredness of his grief, and in doing so, reminded others that some things aren't meant to be shared for likes or profit. They're meant to be held close, honored in silence, and passed on only when the time feels right. Whoopi too carried the lesson forward in her own way. She never brought it up boastfully, but she wove its spirit into her work. On the show, she became more intentional, not less funny, but more thoughtful. She'd catch herself mid-joke sometimes, pause and say, "You know what? Maybe that's not the right thing to say." And instead of awkwardness, the audience would applaud, not for the correction, but for the awareness. She also began mentoring young journalists and hosts, always telling them the same thing. Your words have weight, even the throwaway ones. So choose them like you mean them. Off camera, she quietly supported grief counseling programs, especially for families who'd lost loved ones to cancer. She never made public announcements about her donations. She just showed up, sometimes in person, sometimes with a note that simply read, "For Kim." The studio itself became a different kind of space. New guests often remarked how calm it felt, how respectful. "It's like everyone here knows something important happened," one actor said after taping. The crew would smile but never explain. They didn't need to. The energy was enough. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, almost 6 years to the day after that original interview, something unexpected happened. Keanu returned to the show. Not for a movie. Not for promotion. Just because Whoopi asked and he said yes. The audience didn't know he was coming. When he walked out, there was a beat of stunned silence, then thunderous applause, not just of excitement, but of recognition. Like they were welcoming back someone who'd changed something in them without even trying. Whoopi stood up. Not for show. Just because she wanted to. They hugged, briefly, warmly, and when they sat down, there was no need for small talk. "You still wearing it?" she asked, gently nodding toward his chest. He touched the pendant lightly. "Every day," she smiled. Good, they didn't rehash the past. They didn't perform healing. They just talked about life, about how time doesn't erase loss but teaches you how to carry it. About how kindness is a daily choice, not a grand gesture. At one point, Whoopi turned to the camera and said, "I think we all learned something that day. Not just me, all of us, and I'm grateful for it." Keanu looked out at the audience. "Me too," he said. "Because it reminded me that honesty can connect people, even when it starts with a mistake." Later, during a break, a stagehand, a woman who'd been there that first day, handed Keanu a small envelope. Inside was a photo. It showed her son, holding a framed picture of his late father, wearing his dad's old watch on a chain. On the back, she'd written, "You gave us all permission to remember out loud. Thank you." He tucked the photo into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. That night, clips from the reunion segment spread online. But this time, the comments weren't just emotional, they were reflective. 6 years later, and this still hits me. "I wear my sister's ring now. Because of you." This is why I tell my kids, be gentle. You never know. But the most powerful responses came offline, in homes, in classrooms, in quiet moments between friends. A father finally told his daughter about the brother he'd lost as a child. A woman dug out her mother's old scarf and wore it to work for the first time in decades. A teenager stopped hiding the bracelet his best friend gave him before he passed and instead wore it proudly to school. None of it was loud. None of it needed an audience. But it was real, and that's the thing about true impact. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows up in the way someone pauses before making a joke, in the way a stranger offers a kind word instead of a judgment, in the way grief is no longer something to get over, but something to carry with dignity. Keanu never set out to start a movement. Whoopi never meant to spark a shift. They were just two people being human in real time, and in that honesty they gave the rest of us a mirror and a map. Because in the end, the story wasn't really about a necklace. It was about love that outlives death. It was about the courage to say, "I'm sorry." It was about choosing grace over ego every single time. And years from now, when someone sees a simple silver pendant and feels a quiet pang of recognition, they won't think of a TV show or a celebrity. They'll think of their own person, their own memory, their own reason for carrying something close. And in that moment, silent, personal, sacred, the ripple will keep going. Not because it was planned, but because it was true.